I'm Bruce Levine, and I'm the director of the Drexel DC Center. I'm also a member of the faculty at the School of Education. Just in case I heard a few of you wondering about why we're here, who we are. If you don't know, Drexel is a comprehensive private university in Philadelphia, about 25,000 students. About 4 years ago, our provost decided to establish this office here without totally knowing why, but they just said, we think it's a good thing to be in DC. So I was one of the faculty who was asked to be here, and a couple years ago I took over as the director. We now do a lot of programming like this. We also have started some hybrid degree and certificate programs. We have an EDD that just started in the winter that's here. So we're trying to make this more of an active center than it was. I thought before we got started, and I'll explain a little bit about the genesis of this event, and then we'll move right into the meat of it, but I thought it might be useful if everybody just sort of said your name, if you're affiliated with some organization, what that is, and maybe your role with the organization. And Jenny, I don't know if you can kick us off.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Morris, and I co-teach with Annette Weichlein down there in the corner. We are down at Progresso Literacy and Citizenship Center in Alexandria, and I volunteer with her. Annette is really the citizenship component of our class, and then I follow on and sort of reinforce the concepts on Thursdays and do a little bit more of the literacy component with those students.
Thanks.
I'm Christina Schoendorf. I'm director of UCM's Progresso and Literacy Citizenship Center, and we are for immigrant and refugees. We are for adults. UCM has a very large footprint on Route 1 corridor of Fairfax County, which has a lot of immigrant, refugee, a lot of poverty. We have a large food pantry. We have from 0 to senior citizens. We help everybody. And so I brought 3 of our volunteer teachers.
Great.
Awesome. And I'm Maria. I teach citizenship one of the evenings during the week.
And my name is Annette, and as Jenny said, I teach the morning civics class on Tuesdays with Progresso.
My name is Gerald Garcia, and I work out of Rockville. I am a part-time, if you want to call it. It's less than part-time, but I teach citizenship and the most basic level of English to an organization called Community Ministries for Rockville, out in Rockville. So,
Great.
hi, everybody.
My name is Ben Marion. I work for the Adult Literacy Resource Center at the DC Public Library, and I'm an education specialist. I do outreach and training.
Carol Walchuk. I teach at Carlos Rosario. I've taught citizenship classes there for many years. Carlos Rosario is an adult public charter school with 2 campuses in DC. We have about 2,200 students come a day to the school. We offer 8+ levels of ESL and GED and career training, and it's a really dynamic environment. We're also looking at civic engagement. We want to expand our citizenship program, and we're now adding this blended learning component to the citizenship class.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Jordan Alexander. I am the Student Support Specialist for Literacy Council of Northern Virginia. We're located in Falls Church. Sorry?
Ruba.
Yeah, Ruba is
I
my
work a lot with
coworker.
her. We have a project together.
Oh, awesome.
Starting April.
So yes, being the Student Support Coordinator, I'm responsible for managing the tutoring program, which does feature a lot of recent immigrants from Latin America and Asia, as well as some from Europe. The 2 teachers who would typically be here were not able to make it because of the weather, so I am just here today and very happy to meet you all.
I'm Leah Saul. I am a faculty member at Loyola University, and we're co-sponsoring this program with Drexel. We're in Baltimore City. That's our main campus, but we have campuses in Columbia and in Timonium as well, and we have some sites in Montgomery County and PG County, and probably coming to a spot on the red line near you at some point. I work in our literacy program as a graduate faculty, and Mostly we, at least in our literacy program, work with people who are coming back to school to be reading specialists. But I'm also an adult literacy teacher. And I teach at South Baltimore Learning Center in the city. And I teach ABE.
I'm Vera Lee. I'm at the Philadelphia campus of Drexel University, so Bruce's colleague. And I teach in the teacher ed program, so it's primarily K-12, but I have a real interest in intergenerational literacy, family literacy. And so then Bruce and I have done work around that together.
I'll introduce you. I'll introduce him in a minute, but just quickly in terms of the genesis of today, Leah, Vera, and I were at a conference a few years ago, the Literacy Research Association, and we were having lunch with some other colleagues afterwards. This was shortly after the 2016 election, and we were all sort of contemplating the state of citizenship and citizenship engagement and literacy. And we kind of started wondering, what could we do to perhaps strengthen and grow the capacity, particularly for adult education in that area? And so after a series of conversations, we sent out a survey. I don't know, some of you may have received it, because we wanted to see what people like you in the profession would be interested in discussing, possibly essentially going through professional development in a sort of more informal way. And we got a great response back, a lot of interest, and interest across the range, working specifically with immigrants, media literacy, citizen engagement. There was a lot to choose from as to where we would start. But basically, we thought, let's try to make use of this center and invite professionals in from the area, bring in someone like Eric, who I'll introduce in a minute, and ourselves, and have a dialogue about what people are doing, what we could be doing, what would be some great things to work on in the future. And then we'll see where we go from here. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about where we might go from here. So that's really why we're here today. Meant to be casual, and hopefully we bring some expertise to it, but you all do too. So I think hopefully it'll be a great session. So with that, so what we're going to do is we're going to have our sort of keynote to start with. We'll take a little bit of a break after that. There will be food out there, and we can go out there and get that, come back in, and then have sort of a working workshop that Leah and Vera will take the lead on. And then after another short break, Eric will then take us through another workshop, and then we'll close up for the day. That sounds good. All right, so standing next to me is Dr. Eric Jacobson, and Eric's been involved in education for over 2 decades as a teacher, researcher, and advocate. He's on the board of the New Jersey Association for Lifelong Learning, and he's a volunteer ESOL teacher at Make the Road, New Jersey, and he's also a faculty member at Montclair State in New Jersey. And so he's got this intriguingly titled presentation he'll take us through, and then we'll have some question and answer opportunities after that. So Eric, thank you.
All right, thanks. We don't have to wait for the question and answers. I mean, it's called a keynote, but we're in a small room, and so at any point, if you have thoughts, comments, questions, certainly stop me, and we can have a dialogue as we're going through it. I'm approaching my 3rd decade in adult education. So I started as an adult ESL teacher. As an undergrad, I was a religious studies major. But as a militant agnostic, that was not a career path. So I really couldn't do anything with it. But it was a very interdisciplinary department, so that's where I liked it. And so then, when I got my first ESL job teaching adults, I was like, why didn't anybody tell me this job existed? This is like the greatest job in the world. Like, you get to meet people from all over the world and learn about things and have that. This is the greatest thing ever. And so now I'm a lifer. So I started teaching ESL. I taught citizenship for a number of years. I taught ESL for home building for a while. That was really interesting with home builders. I think they're based in DC, and they're a national organization. So I did the ESL and a little bit of the math for home building. My dad was a carpenter, so I felt like I'm not a very good carpenter, but I drew on that. So I've done a little bit of this, and did some family literacy, did a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So I'm really sort of committed to lifelong learning for myself and also lifelong learning for other folks. So I'm happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk to other adult educators. So the title So the critical civic education and epistemological humility. So when Leah asked me to come and talk, she was like, this is kind of what the series is about. It's kind of like conceptualizing citizenship education or civic education sort of from a kind of a progressive or sort of like a contemporary perspective. So as part of that, the first thing that jumped to my mind was the need for epistemological humility. And I'll unpackage this a little bit, right? I'll talk about theory for maybe like 3 minutes, and then I'll talk about some of my own experience, both way back in the 90s when I started teaching citizenship in ESL, and some of the stuff that I'm doing now in Elizabeth at Make the Road, New Jersey. Make the Road, New Jersey is a community-based organization. It's the sister organization from Make the Road, New York. There's also one now in Pennsylvania. And it's basically an organization for immigrants mainly from Latin America and Central America. And it provides ESL, provides citizenship, and they're involved in a lot of different advocacy campaigns. So are any of you familiar with the term epistemology? No? All right. So epistemology is basically a theory of knowledge. Right? So how do you understand knowledge? So not just what you know, but how you understand facts to be verified, how you understand the world to be framed and organized. So epistemology is really how you conceptualize the world and how you argue for the validity of that conception, right? So the idea is not only do we all have different experiences in the world and different background knowledge, but we also have different ways of organizing the knowledge in our head, right? And we have different ways of claiming truths, right? So I was just talking about my students this the other day, my MSU students, not my adult ed students, right? So when how many of you have looked at the Common Core, had to deal with the Common Core for K-12 kids? All right, so lucky you. So in the Common Core, there's lots of stuff about like, evidence-based analysis, right? Text-based analysis, right? So what did you see in the text to back up your argument? But as part of that, I think we need to unpackage that, right? Because all texts don't argue for truth the same way, right? Sometimes when you read something, they try to convince you on the basis of facts, right? Sometimes people try to convince you on the basis of emotions or feelings and that sort of stuff, right? So when we're reading a text, we have to think about why the text is asking us to believe what it's saying, right? Maybe they're convincing us via argument, maybe they're appealing to my emotions, right? So there's different ways of doing that. So that's all to say that when we're thinking about epistemology, when we're thinking about how you understand the world, we can understand the world in radically different ways and have different truth claims based on our experiences and where we're coming from. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, and other people can jump in if you want to add to definitions of epistemology, right? And so, this may be the only time in my life that I'm going to quote Donald Rumsfeld. And when Rumsfeld made this statement, he was kind of ridiculed. But this may be the only thing that Rumsfeld ever said that I would agree with, other than maybe like, today's Tuesday, right? So like, we would probably be in agreement on that, right? But Rumsfeld famously said, we kind of have the known knowns, we have the known unknowns, and we have the unknown unknowns, right? And people are like, that's gobbledygook. And I'm like, no, it's not actually, right? There's things that we know. There's things that we know we don't know. And there's stuff that we don't know, right? And in some ways, the things that we don't know are sort of the scariest, right? Because if you know that you don't know it, you can either find out, ask somebody, or certainly temper your opinion, right? By not speaking about things that you don't know about, right? So
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Although it is the United States and it's everybody's God-given right to pontificate on things that they have no information about whatsoever, right? So I think Rumsfeld's quote is actually quite helpful here, right? When we're thinking about what we know, what we don't know, and what we don't know, particularly when we're thinking about working with our students, right? There's going to be things about our students, their lives, their goals that we know. There's going to be things about our students' lives that we know we don't know. And there's going to be things about our students' lives that we don't know, right? Which puts us at risk of misconceptions, presuming certain things and sort of like creating what I called in some other papers epistemological misunderstandings, right? So like we're having a conversation and we think we're actually communicating and agreeing, but we're actually not in agreement whatsoever, right? We're not even having the same conversation, even though we're talking to each other at the same time. So if we think about this in the world of education, there's a writer, Bell Hooks. If you haven't read Bell Hooks, I would suggest reading Bell Hooks. She's a really, really, I think, influential and provocative writer. And she does the lowercase, so I should put like, she's kind of E.E. Cummings thing, the lowercase b, lowercase h. So she's an African-American woman, academic, and she talks about this experience where when she's having a class, focusing class on African-American women writers, that sometimes when other students in the class start using other language or other dialects, right, African-American vernacular English or Spanish or other things like that, that sometimes the white students in class sort of got upset, right, and disturbed, like, wait a minute, what's going on? Like, the linguistic context is really confusing right now. And she suggests, particularly with regards to African-American vernacular English, because they're using vocabulary, they're using terminology that they know, but they don't understand what's going on, right? So they're using English, but the other students in the class are using English, but the white students in class don't get what's going on, all right? And what she suggests is, rather than that being a moment of anxiety, that's a moment to learn, right? And so what she suggests is, this is a moment of epistemological humility, right? So you have to be like, I don't know what's going on, and it's going to take me a while to kind of understand this conversation, understand this dialogue, and that's okay, right? And as part of that, she suggests that we don't have to be the masters of every conversation that we're in, right? There's times when there's going to be a dialogue or conversation going on around you, you don't have enough information, right? So you can just be like, all right, that's okay. That's okay. My 2 cents are not required in every conversation, and it's okay for me to not understand what's going on, right? So I think this is a really, really helpful way of thinking about teaching, right? Because there's going to be lots of times when we're having conversations with our students, or our students are having conversations with each other, and we don't really understand what's going on, and that's okay, right? We shouldn't feel completely, anxious about it. Okay. Similarly, there is an adult educator named Paulo Freire who was kind of famous for being kind of a critical adult educator. He worked in Brazil, worked a lot with poor folks and marginalized folks. And what he talks about is an unquiet pedagogy, right? So not having lots and lots of certainties, right? So as teachers, to have humility in terms of what we think we know and how we think we know it, right? And the more unquiet we are, the more uncertain we are, the more open we are to learning from our students and working with our students, right? And that means you have to investigate. So if you don't have a lot of certainties, as a teacher, that means you have to do the legwork, right? You have to work with your students, you have to read up, you have to explore, you have to teach yourself and learn, right? So you don't come into the classroom with a set of certainties and then proceed from there. You have to be open to investigation. So here's 2 examples that I could give from my own life, right? I think whenever we ask, do you know the term compositional risk? Have you heard this term? So compositional risk is often used in K-12. It's like when students have to write an essay or write a poem or something in class and then have to share it. We talk about that as compositional risk because students are kind of putting themselves out there, right? So I always think that if a teacher asks a student to write something and share it in class, a teacher should do so as well. It's not fair to ask a student to read something out loud and to not do it yourself. Similarly, when you're talking about your background, I think you need to be willing to share as well. So here's kind of 2 key moments in my own development as an educator. In the mid-90s, there was a nationwide adult ed effort called Equipped for the Future. And the idea was to develop a curriculum standard that would help adult educators develop lesson plans and syllabi. And rather than thinking about it in terms of sort of grade levels, it had different domains. So finding information, networking, analyzing text, these sort of kind of real world uses of language. So I was in a trial part of it for finding and analyzing information. And I was teaching in the basement of a public housing complex in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And so one of the things that my students told me that I didn't know was that you can use a public payphone. They don't exist anymore, but back in the 90s they did. You could use a public payphone to call and get information, right? Because on your home phone at that time, and probably still today, you get what, like, you don't have to do it anymore because you can Google it, but back then, 3 or 4 calls a month, and then after that, if you called for information, it would be like 25 cents per call for information. So a number of my students were like, we simply can't afford to call information, right? We just don't have the money for that. So what we do is we go out to the street, we go to the payphone, and we call information on the payphone, we write the number down, and then we go back to our apartment and make the call, right? So I was like, I had no idea, right? So, I was on government food when I was in high school. I was a reduced lunch kid. I had the big vats of peanut butter and big blocks of government cheese. But as far as I know, we never had to go outside to use a payphone, right? So when this moment happened, I was uneasy, right? I was like, what didn't I know? What assumptions was I making? On the one hand, I sort of let myself off the hook for not knowing the payphone thing, because that's just kind of a logistical thing that I shouldn't expect myself to know. But not really knowing the lived experience of my students in terms of the depths of their poverty, that it required them to go and use a payphone, that was something that I didn't know, right? And so that made me think, all right, I really have to think about what I understand about my students' lives when I'm working together with them. Similarly, and this is way back in the 90s, I was doing a lot of work in the Haitian community in Boston in the early 90s. And for any of you know the kind of the history of Haiti, President Aristide was sort of like sent into exile, and then President Clinton helped him get back in office in 1994. Now, as someone who is left of center, I was not totally happy with Aristide going back, because of the compromises that I felt that he needed to make, right? So I thought, he's gonna let multinational corporations come in, now he's tight with the US military, so there's all these things that I was like, I wanted him to go back, but I think it's kind of a devil's bargain that he went back, right? But then talking to my Haitian students, they're like, my family can walk down the streets of Port-au-Prince right now and not get shot. And I'm like, okay, right? So this was really me going beyond what I knew, right? And having an opinion about something far beyond my expertise on that subject matter, right? So that was really, really humbling. That, like, as somebody from the US, I might have strong political opinions, never lived in Haiti, never worked in Haiti. Who am I to criticize Aristide for making a deal with the US government to go back to be president of this country, right? So these are only 2 examples. On a daily basis, I'm sure, I do things wrong, I exceed my reach. But for me, when I think about my own growth as a teacher, I keep reflecting on these moments about, like, what do I know? How do I think that I know it? Okay. So then, let's think about citizenship and sort of civic education for adults. So if we think about kind of 3 different general forms of adult education, right? People talk about formal adult education. These are programs, you complete them, you get certificates, you get to pass through to the next level. There's non-formal adult education, which is, organized and sequential, but it doesn't give you a degree, doesn't give you a diploma or anything at the end. And then there's kind of informal adult learning that takes place kind of every day, right, as we're out in the world, right? So from the citizenship level, citizenship test prep is certainly part of formal adult education, right? For those of you that are teaching, you have X number of weeks, you have tests that the students have to pass, they jump through those hoops, and then they go to, then they go to the government and they pass the 100 questions and they do their English exam, right? When I taught citizenship, it was really interesting to me to, occasionally I would go, a friend of mine was studying to become like a video tech for a cable place. And so we went out with his camera and kind of like jaywalking style on the old Tonight Show. I would just go up to people on the street and ask them questions from the 100-question test for citizenship. I'd be first like, are you a native-born citizen? Yeah. And I'd be like, how many reps are there? And I'd be like, I don't know, gotta go. so most of the people I asked, they're all like, don't know. So we can certainly ask questions about, what we require of people becoming naturalized citizens versus, what we require of people that were born here. So we have formal citizenship test prep, and then non-formal, I would say these are these sort of organizational efforts about get out the vote, or when people in your neighborhood are like, I stayed in Georgetown last night, and next to a canal that didn't have any water in it.
Oh.
So when I searched for the hotel, I was like, oh, this is Canalside. This would be very pretty and quaint, picturesque. And I walked up on the bridge and I was like, it's a dirt path, right? So, but then I saw there was a poster or something that was like revitalizing the canal or something.
Your dick is.
I should have been suspicious when there's a picture of Eisenhower on it. These types of things are also part of sort of civic education, right? So we want to expand public transportation, right? Or we want to expand access to the driver's licenses, or we want to expand coverage of health insurance, right? These types of things we're conceptualizing our community in a particular way, right? And we're trying to reach out to other people to educate them about these issues and then participate in the political process to try to reach those ends, right? And so you've all probably, I think, down the hall, is that the ICANN, right? So ICANN, the International Committee to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, right? So when they do work in the communities, right, they're trying to convince people of the danger of nuclear weapons, right? So when they're out on the street petitioning or tabling, right, they're also engaging in civic education because they're putting forth a picture of the community, a picture kind of civic institutions and trying to educate people to kind of go along with them, right? Now, there's also lots of informal civic education, right? So the self-study that we all engage in. So for example, right now I'm really interested in civil forfeiture, right? Do you know what civil forfeiture is? Mm-hmm. So civil forfeiture is basically the government can grab your stuff, right? So I'm really interested
without
in...
being charged.
Without being charged, right? And maybe somebody in your family's being charged and they take the car that they possibly used, right? So I'm really interested in what civil forfeiture is and how we kind of push back on civil forfeiture. So that's my informal sort of self-study project right now, right? And most of us have self-study projects trying to become informed about the community and about civic participation. And we also have informal socialization, right? Which is what are the messages that you get about what type of citizenship is valued, what types of things do people appreciate, right? So if you're a K-12 student and you take a knee during the national anthem, that apparently is not okay, right? Society sends you certain messages about that, right? As opposed to marching with a picket sign and that's okay, right? Or baptizing your guns. Have you seen that? In Pennsylvania, in Pennsylvania, people married their guns. They held their AR-15. They wore like a tiara of bullets, and they dabbed the holy water on the assault rifle as they were holding it.
Don't you just love America?
Yes. Yeah. So it sounds crazy. If you go and look at the pictures, it's even crazier looking than it sounds. Right? So people in a church.
Oh my God.
Let me repeat that. People in a church with assault weapons wearing a crown of bullets.
Where is this?
This is in Pennsylvania.
Not Texas?
Not Texas.
No,
Just a few hours.
So I knew there was a reason I was in the Drexel office in DC, not... I don't know what you guys are doing.
So think about, if you were born here or raised here, right? So from day one, you're getting all these messages from society about how to be a citizen, what it means to be a citizen, right? And so if you're an immigrant to this country, you're having to negotiate that as well, right? And you may be able to pick up the subtle signals and the not so subtle signals about what we expect of you as a citizen. Okay? Within my citizenship class, when I taught explicitly a citizenship class, even though it was a formal class, I believe that there's room for thinking about citizenship and civic education sort of from a critical perspective, right? So these are questions that I would consistently ask my students when I was teaching citizenship, right? And they were doing the whole thing. We were taking the practice tests, they were working on their English, all these sorts of things. But while we were doing that, we're asking these sorts of questions too, right? So why are you doing this? Why are you becoming a citizen, right? So everybody has a different answer, right? And what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? What is your lived reality of a transnational identity? So transnational identity is feeling like you're a citizen of at least two different countries, right? So For example, if you're Haitian American, you may go back and forth between Haiti and the US, right? And your identity is not defined wholly by either country, right? So you feel yourself both kind of a citizen of Haiti and a citizen of the United States. This would often come up in a joking but serious way when I would be like, all right, so the World Cup is coming up. Who are you rooting for in the World Cup? And they'd be like, not the US, right? And I'd be like, are you rooting for Mexico? Are you rooting for whoever? And I was like, you're rooting for Colombia? All right, because your identity is really complex, right? So, what? Yeah, no, so much better, right? Not on the women's side.
No, not on the women's side.
Not on the women's side. So let's be real and not pretend that you're just becoming a U.S. citizen. Yep.
Well, that's a pretty deep question, because from the inception of somebody becoming a U.S. citizen, in a very generalized way, people have to give up their passports from their own countries.
Yes.
So, you know, how do you define your transnational identity anymore?
So on the piece of paper,
Right.
it's very black and white, right? Who are you now legally?
Right.
But who you are legally is not the same as who you are in your lived reality or what you feel, right? So this is something I think we often have to think about. Also, what do you think about the nature of the process, right? So you're becoming a U.S. citizen. What do you think about the process of becoming a citizen, right? So do you think this is fair, right? That you're having to take this test, that you're having to answer these questions, right? If I can go out on the street with a video camera and native-born U.S. citizens can't answer any of these questions, and you can, is that fair, right? Similarly, what do you think about the nature of the test, right? So if you look at the 100 questions, if you look at some of those questions, some of them are like simply wrong, right? I mean, like there used to be, I'm not sure if there still is, there's a question about when Columbus discovered America.
No.
Right?
No.
Good, that's gone. So in the 90s, there was still a question about when Columbus discovered America, right? And there would also be questions about, like, you know, who does the U.S. Constitution protect people's rights? And you're like, maybe theoretically, maybe not always in person. So then, I would always talk to my students, do you need to think strategically about anything? So, you know, when the Columbus question was on the test, right, so my students would say, yes, right? So you're like, yes. And so we talked about important idiomatic language, like I've got my fingers crossed behind my back, right? So like, I know that Columbus didn't discover America in 1492. This is not when I'm gonna protest, right? I'm gonna pass the test, I'm gonna become a citizen, I'm gonna jump through this hoop, and then afterwards I can complain about the fact that this test doesn't seem to accurately capture U.S. history. I had a student from China once who was institutionalized during the Cultural Revolution, right? So she was put in a mental institution because she ran afoul of Mao's folks, right? So on the form, right, it says, have you ever been institutionalized, da-da-da-da-da. So we sat down.
Mentally competent.
Are you mentally competent? So we had a long conversation. So on the form, if you say yes to any of those things, like, are you a Nazi, are you communist, da-da-da, it doesn't automatically disqualify you. But if you say no and they find out that you're wrong, then you are automatically disqualified, right? So then she and I had a really long conversation about what do you put down, right? Do you put down yes and hope that the officer that you talk to understands that you were there because you were a political prisoner, not because you actually, had some mental health issues? Do you trust that they understand the history of the Cultural Revolution, or do you not, right? And so we ended up putting no, right? Because we're just gonna say no because we don't want to get into it. She became a citizen and it was fine, right? But we had to think strategically about the use of the form.
Well, this is where I acknowledge that I'm also a lawyer, and I would be very upset to hear about teachers doing this. So I'm still laying it on the table, because we might come back to this many times.
Yeah.
But I don't think that that's the correct way to handle it.
Okay.
And I would actually encourage teachers to tell people, let me help you find legal assistance on this.
Okay, right, that's a good example of All right, so, so within this formal education class, there's still a chance to ask kind of critical questions, to think deeply about citizenship, and not just go through the motions of passing the test. All right, so within that class, I tried to complement the sort of formal learning structure with informal learning. So I ended up doing 3 service learning projects with my students. So one was a Christmas toy drive. So we collected toys and then we wrapped them and then we brought them to the mayor's office, which then distributed them. That was my idea as kind of a model service learning project, and then the next two were student initiated ideas. So volunteering at a homeless shelter, so we went to a homeless shelter and cooked and served food, and then volunteering at a senior citizens home to kind of like talk to folks and kind of make them feel a little bit less lonely. So the Christmas toy drive was interesting because we would have debates about what toy, like the gendered nature of a toy, because the mayor's office wanted it labeled, right? Because they didn't want to, when they passed out the toys, they were going to do it on a gendered basis. So we would have conversations about like, what's a horse? Like, what's a truck? And it'd be like, come on, this is ridiculous. So volunteering at the homeless shelter was really, really interesting because, you know, within my citizenship class, there was a range of socioeconomic status, right? So I had some students in there that were working class, and I had some students there that were, you know, they had come over as professionals and they were trying to become U.S. citizens, and they were a little bit higher up on the status. So what I would suggest is, while we were involved in these projects, my students were acting as informal civic educators, right? So by modeling being engaged in the community and by modeling connecting to multiple organizations and multiple groups of people, they were acting as educators. They were teaching other people how to behave, how to do things within your community, okay? As one option of being civically engaged. So what I'm doing now in New Jersey is much more explicit, all right? So rather than being informal civic educators, my students are really explicit civic educators, right? And they're doing this in 3 different ways. So I've been involved with my students on 3 different projects. So one of them was a project to get a municipal ID within Elizabeth. So we wanted a ID so that the students within the city, you know, could go to the library, could go to schools, do various things. New Jersey, more and more municipalities in New Jersey are starting to pass municipal IDs. Dealing with ICE, like how do you deal with ICE directly? And there's lawyers on staff, so I didn't make any things there. And then the campaign to expand access to driver's license, which is what we're working on right now. Right? So for the municipal IDs, one of the things that I did with my students was they went to the Elizabeth Town Hall to make a presentation arguing for municipal IDs. And so as part of that, we created a video that was shown at the town hall and was also streamed by the organization.
Yes, I live in Elizabeth. I love Elizabeth. Elizabeth is my home. That's home that my family.
My name is Nancy. I live in Elizabeth with my family. I like Elizabeth because I think I have a lot of things to do. My children go to the school here. I like Elizabeth.
Yes, I like Elizabeth. For me, Elizabeth is beautiful. Elizabeth is my home because my family lives here.
I love it.
So we had a conversation. If you want the town council people to hear you, how do you get them on your side? Well, you begin by buttering them up. Right? So like, I like Elizabeth, like this is a reason I'm happy to be in Elizabeth, so like, yay Elizabeth. And once we've established yay Elizabeth, then we'll make the argument for, you know, why we need the municipal ID. So you don't walk up to somebody and say, give me $5, right? You're like,
Basically marketing.
marketing, right? And so we talked about what's the rhetoric that you would use, right? And so they talked about like it's safe, it's nice, it's beautiful, my kids are here. And then the students identified the particular reasons that they would want municipal IDs.
I'm happy to be here because I think Elizabeth is beautiful and loves us to do. If I have an ID, I would feel...
This woman's name is Olga, and she was actually, her and her family were featured on NPR last year. She's undocumented, and it was about her whole family. So they had a series on NPR.
If I had an ID, I could show it to security when I want to pick my daughters up at school.
So all of this content was generated by the students. Right? I would say, what's the reasons that you think Elizabeth needs a municipal ID. They shared their ideas. Sometimes we like massage the English, right? And we worked on the English. And so then they practiced their script, and you can see some of them are sort of sticking to the script. But this is their language and their
My name
ideas.
is Victor. I have lived in this beautiful city 1 year. I love it.
It's the hard sound. Beautiful sound. Okay, so you get the idea here. So, and it was nice because this is a campaign that worked, right? They actually did get IDs in Elizabeth. So it's really nice to see the work result in a good thing.
Your citizenship students helped organize this? Obviously, they're
No,
not citizenship.
no, so this is not citizenship class.
Right.
What I would say
Okay.
that this is understood as civic education,
Okay, right.
right?
Right.
So that these students are not trained to be citizenship.
No, I was
students.
wondering if your citizenship students were involved in this.
This was a different class,
Okay.
so maybe 1 or 2, but it was conceptualized as a different thing.
So how did you get the civic engagement class? What's that under, what's the office?
So they have an ESL, they had an existing ESL class, and the organization is very dedicated to these sort of advocacy efforts. So I came in and it was basically like, do any of these students want to do like an additional ESL class where we can really focus on their advocacy efforts and creating videos, creating like public outreach, right? So that they can take their advocacy like the next step and figure out what English they need to be able to do that.
So are these people working 2 jobs and have families and all the rest of it?
Yeah.
I mean, I would have.
Yeah, and they show up on the picket lines and the protest lines, and they're everywhere all the time. They're
And
just,
your ideas with other administrators, how were they received?
well, because the organization is dedicated to advocacy,
I got it.
they were like, you want to come in and teach a free
I got it.
ESL class about advocacy in English? Great.
Sure.
Great, sure, come in and do it. So the larger ESL class is, maybe a little bit lower in terms of their English skills, right? So this is maybe more the higher level students, but not all higher level students. Some of them are in there just because they really want to work on their English for advocacy and create these kind of public documents.
You have many students who are Peruvian. I can hear their accent.
Yes. There's a few of them. Yes, there's a few of them. Okay. Then, not surprisingly, we had a whole big thing about how to deal with ICE. And then later, I'm going to share an 8-page curriculum that we developed on kind of how to deal with ICE in terms of like what to say, what you can't say, these types of things. And as part of that, when I talk about it later, is that to integrate the grammar into it. So for one thing, one part of the grammar is use of the imperative, right? And so here's an example of the students using the imperative. So this is the thing that they did for a May Day rally.
On May 1st at 3 p.m., join us at Liberty State Park to stand up for immigrants. Stand up, fight back. 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 Stand up, fight back.
So there, rather than kind of being sequential, we're going to do some advocacy stuff, then we're going to do some English vocabulary and grammar, it's all integrated. So as part of saying stand up, fight back, you're working with the imperative, right? And so I have a lesson on dealing with that kind of based on Simon Says, but then going into a place that they can actually use. What I'm doing right now, there's a proposal before the New Jersey legislature to expand access to driver's license to people who are out of status. So right now I'm working with my students on this campaign. So we've done things like, here's the petition, so that they have the petition, they understand how to use it. Here's the bill itself, and it's got a statement at the end, and so I took the statement and I broke it into different parts, and we talked about the language of the statement. There's a larger campaign called Let's Drive New Jersey, and they've identified kind of road safety, contributions to the economy, and kind of well-being and health as reasons that people would support expanded access to the driver's license. So as part of that, I'm working with my students, all right, so within that framework, make that argument. right? So what do we mean by road safety? What do we mean by the economy? What do we mean by health and well-being? So students are coming up with their own language to make those points. And I've got I gave them a handout with kind of a basic dialogue, which is like, you're at the table that says, let's drive New Jersey, and you say, hey, can I talk to you about our campaign? And I go, what's your campaign? And you're like, well, it's to expand driver's licenses. And I say, why should I support that? And then there's like a big empty spot, right? And it's like, this is why you should support it, right? And then at the bottom of it, I say either, great, I'll sign it, or no thanks. And then you say, thanks for signing it, or thank you for your time, or this kind of stuff, right? So they're working on the language they need when they're sitting at a table and people are walking by and they're going, are you interested in our campaign, right? So again, not formal citizenship, but certainly part of civic education, right? They're trying to educate people in their community about the need for expanded access to driver's license, right? And as part of it, we talk about, what are the good parts of the law? What do you think are the most important parts of the law? For example, you can't charge people more money for insurance if they've got this kind of ID, this kind of driver's license, and you can't, theoretically, you can't discriminate against somebody. If the cops pull you over and you show them that ID, that state-issued driver's license, they can't say, oh, well, that means you're undocumented. They're not allowed to use that as evidence that you're undocumented. All right. So what I don't know now, there's plenty of things that I still don't know, right? So one of the things that I don't know, I didn't know you needed an official ID to travel across state lines on a bus or a train. So, and my students tell me that they feel like they can't take these trips, and so that this ID, this state-issued ID, would actually not necessarily give them the ability to do that, right? And then you need an official ID to use a library, right? And perhaps our resident lawyer, maybe this is, my students misunderstand this, but this is their experience. If they feel like if they don't have an official ID, they can't get on a bus or a train.
I think I feel safe, but I've never heard of that.
Okay. And then at a deeper level, things that I don't know what risks my students are facing on a daily basis, right? I simply don't know their day-to-day reality. I don't know what risks they're facing when they're engaged in activism, right? So when we're both walking down the streets of Elizabeth, going, estamos en la lucha, right? We're having very different experiences. Sure. Right? We're having very, very different experiences, right? And then similarly, I don't know what the limits of my imagination are, right? So there may be lots of unknown unknowns about my students' lives and experiences, right? So the known unknowns, I'm okay with feeling unaware about, right? Because I can talk to them and I can learn. But the unknown stuff that my students face, I'm really behind. All right. So a couple of big questions. So people who talk about critical pedagogy, Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, other people, there's this kind of paradox at the heart of it, right? Which is that I'm here to help you increase your sense of agency and your level of political clarity. Right? So, but that's paradoxical that I'm telling you that you should be more agentic on your part, that you should have more sense of self-efficacy. So that's counterproductive, right? So ways to avoid that, I think, is to really kind of embrace epistemological humility, right? So that you're not in the classroom going I have political clarity, and I would really hope you guys get it too, right? And I'm here to help you get political clarity, right? Or I've got a strong sense of self-efficacy and agency, and I think you all need that too. That's really contradictory, right? So the questions I think that it leaves us with, and then I think we're going to pick up some of this in the conversation, right? So when you start projects like this, right, what do the students want? Right? They want English, right? They want English. Wherever it is, they want English, right? And then in these types of cases, they want support for their advocacy efforts, right? So they want help on the driver's license, they want help on the municipal IDs, that sort of stuff, right? And they want lots of other stuff too, right? But that's where we start with. And then what do you have to offer, right? So if we are being sort of humble about what we know, what are we bringing to the table, right? There's a great, and if you read The Onion, there's a great Onion photo a couple years ago that says, teacher that learns more from students than they learn from her, fired. And I thought, that's good, right? Because if you're a teacher, like, you actually are responsible for helping your students learn, right? And if you're learning more from them than they're learning from you, you're doing something wrong, right? And so in this class, in this case, right, so what do I bring or other people bring? You bring knowledge of English, right? Sort of particularly pragmatic. Pragmatics is how we use language in certain situations, right? So like, I can help them with how do you address the city council of Elizabeth, right? Like, I have a sense of what the rhetoric would be that might be helpful, right? So I can bring that knowledge with me, right? How is certain language gonna sound, right? I also, and other teachers bring pedagogical expertise, right? So you know how to help them learn English, right? Usually you have access to resources that your students don't, right? And so you can become a bridge for these students, right? And there's other things that you bring as well. And then finally, I would leave us with kind of these three questions. So like, what kind of self-learning projects are we all engaged in, right? So if we think, if we want students in the citizenship classes or civic education classes engaged in this sort of learning about civic education, what are we doing the same thing? Right? Are we learning as well, or are we expecting these non-citizens to be doing things that we're not doing ourselves, right? And then do we tend to work with students that either opt in or test into these programs, right? There's lots of people in community, our state, our city, our country, that could benefit from civic education, but they're not testing into an ESL class or they're not walking through our doors, right? Specifically, how do we work with people in our own communities who hold beliefs that we might find completely abhorrent, right? So there's lots of people in our towns and cities and our states that believe things about our cities and towns and states that we don't agree with, and how do we engage them, right? Are we always working with these marginalized populations and not working with the populations back at home who need more civic education than probably the students in our ESL classes, right? Particularly when people outside the ESL classes may not even believe in sort of civic duty, right? Margaret Thatcher in England said that there is no such thing as society, right? She said basically there's like people and families, and there is no society, right? So then, if someone thinks that there is no society, how do you get them to support each other, to support schools and libraries and hospitals and these sorts of stuff? So we end up working with adult ed students, and that's great, but who's working with students who are not adult ed students who also need civic education and kind of dialogue around civic development, right? Those people are disengaged, right? All right, so here is, I think we'll share the PowerPoint afterwards maybe, but so here's my contact information. Here's my university one, which is the kind of formal stuff, and then this is my non-university one. So, and then if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. And then I think we're gonna break and get some food quickly, and then we're gonna come back, or
Couple of questions.
Yeah, before we break for food.
okay.
Or comments?
So then later I'll walk through this ICE thing, and then later, I think about a month from now, the driver's license document should be done, and I can also send you a copy of the driver's license document, kind of what we're doing around the driver's license.
Well, I'm just interested in other people in this room who have been doing things like that or planning activities like this.
I must say that, so I teach a citizenship class, and I start out from the very beginning to say there's two reasons for this class. One is you need to pass the test. The second is I want you to be a passionate citizen. And so that whole idea of, and so I use the news, they have to watch the news 3 times a week and bring it in, and we talk about it, and I use it to illustrate that Second Amendment versus First Amendment debate, and we talk about how that is, right? So that first of all, that they can feel it and touch it and hold it, and then that they get passionate about it. But so that's very much the way I have in terms of how I teach. But I don't know that I could get them to do yet another activity. I mean, I tried getting them to come to our town hall meeting, and I did brochures on it. I told them to come sit with me, and I could explain it. And only one person showed up out of the whole thing, So, but our folks, they are so tired. They're working all this work, and then they have kids, and it's just.
Well, in that sense, this is not another activity. This is their ESL class.
Yeah, but it's just a hard piece to.
How is your class structured? How long is it?
It's an hour and a half.
An hour and a half, how many weeks?
Once a week. Oh no, it's much more than 10. it's however long it takes.
Yeah, I meet with these students 1 hour, once a week for 2 hours, and it's just an ongoing thing. So it's not a 10-week class or a 12-week class.
Yeah.
It's, here's these students who are interested in this thing,
Kinda like it.
and then sometimes some of them drift out because of jobs or family, and then other people drift in. So the borders of it are very fluid,
Yeah.
and it's just an ongoing ESL class. And so it's not in addition to their other ESL class, it is their ESL class.
See, our ESL classes that are separate from citizenship are semester, and it's funding, so we have to have our outcomes. So so there has to be a completion and our adult retention and, and we have about 32 different countries and about 16 to 17 different languages. So we have mostly Central American, African, and every part of the Middle East.
When I did these were in addition to the class,
Okay.
right? So like,
Right.
because the citizenship class took place at the Learning Center itself, but the homeless shelter, we went to the homeless shelter, right? So the senior citizens home, we went to the senior citizens home. So those hours were over and above what we were doing in the citizenship class.
And one thing we do notice is that for civic engagement, if they have school-age children, they go to everything the school offers.
Mhm.
In Fairfax County, like probably in New Jersey, there's over 75 different identified languages. So it is, everything is in every language.
Yeah.
So they're very good about that. They will get involved when their child is involved.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, most of my students' arguments for various things, it's all about their
Right,
roles as family
exactly.
members, right? So
Yeah.
municipal ID and driver's license are good because I can go to the doctor's office, I can go to the school, and not get worried about getting grabbed or not getting access to my child, right? So they're mostly focused on family stuff. Now, part of that is because that's their experience. Part of that is they also know that that's the rhetoric that the campaigns are using, right? So they're like, how do you get people who aren't affected by this personally to care about these issues, is you talk about families, right? So rather than talking about some sort of inalienable human rights, which may be too abstract for people,
True.
this is about my family. It's about keeping my family together. It's being able to get my kid to the doctor when my kid needs to go to the doctor. And that kind of one-on-one personalized argument, this goes back to the beginning about sort of epistemology, right? What sort of truth claim do you make? Well, this is my lived reality as a parent, and I'm giving you my understanding of the world on the basis of being a parent, right? You're also a parent. You're going to hear what I'm saying about my kids, right? And you're going to be more willing to engage with me because I'm talking about kids and I'm not talking about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, subsection 3, Article J, right? Who cares about that, right? I'm a parent, you're a parent, will you sign this form?
So what makes this very timely for me is that we've been looking across our school at different levels of civic engagement, how to do that, including potentially service learning, where the question is, should individual teachers opt for that? Should cohorts, meaning, teachers who might all teach level 5 or level 6, should they do something together? So we're sort of an experiment on that, and teachers have had various ideas, and some have tried in the past visiting homeless shelters or doing lunch programs, that kind of thing, or going to senior citizens. So also, and we have a student government that does lots of toy drives and coat drives and raise money that go to scholarship funds for our students who are leaving and going on to other programs or university. But we want to ratchet, I think we really want to raise it another level, more of the kind of thing that you're talking about with the municipal IDs, and trying to, I'm throwing this out in case anyone has any ideas. And trying to get them to do sort of work, looking at DC government, because we're in DC and all of our students are DC residents, having an impact of, and again, just sort of brainstorming perhaps on housing-related issues, which is a major, also families and kids in crisis in DC. Maybe partnering with an elementary school. So we're trying to get the student government to build their leadership and advocacy skills, and then engage other students at our school. And again, this is our idea, and we're at the very beginning of it. So
I think in these cases, to speak to your issue about what students have time and energy for, this I don't think, a problem for the students because it is their ESL class, right? So in this case, when we were volunteering at the homeless shelter, when we were going to the senior citizens home, these were things that they were interested in, and we physically went to those locations. But in our class, we had to talk about the English that you needed to use to go to those places. So it didn't feel like just it came out of left field and like, oh, now we're like talking about making a bouillabaisse or something, right? It's not disconnected from my self-learning projects, right? So they're still on task in the sense of they're learning English and practicing their conversation skills and their listening skills and that sort of stuff. It's not on task in the sense of your 100 questions, but it's on task in terms of learning English and kind of being connected.
So I have not completed this project yet. I'm just starting it with my students. So I teach ADE. We are under all of those same grant funding guidelines that you're speaking to. And I teach 3 hours on Monday morning and an hour of my class. Every single class is on inquiry. And inquiry. And all of my students have their own inquiry project. I teach ADE Low, by the way. And they are all working on, I live in Baltimore City, a problem that they self-identified within their local neighborhood that they want to raise attention toward or about. And we're going to be doing, they're all working on very different issues, and we're learning about different neighborhoods and different challenges and how those kind of interact with one another in our city. And then we are all doing a photo voice project because our learners have amazing knowledge and resources, but we're using that as a way to leverage into some of the print literacy skills that the students need. So thus far, according to outcomes, we are actually seeing increasing engagement. I've had probably some of the best attendance, which is one of our metrics, right?
3 hours and failed.
So it's been very interesting. I can't give you like test outcomes yet, but I can report back. And certainly I think they're going to have some very interesting products.
What are some examples of what they're saying?
Examples of what they're saying or examples of what they're studying? So they're all studying very different things. One of them is studying gentrification in their neighborhood. So actually and we're all been taking their projects and learning together about those issues. So actually my lesson introduction for the whole class for the 3 hours was about gentrification and using that terminology and how it's impacting our city. So that's one example. Another, the distrust between the community and the policing system. That's another student's. Another is the problem of homelessness in our city, which is very significant. Gosh, I mean, they run the gamut.
Do they work together? Do they?
No, which is a challenge for me. Which, speaking to this point of this, they certainly collaborate and have conversations and kind of work with each other on some of the resource finding and those kinds of things. But in terms of epistemological humility, I am learning a ton about what I had no idea about, and it is terrifying, to be quite honest. Like in terms of things that I didn't know that I didn't know, and now know that I know. I'm like, oh gosh, I totally screwed this up. I really hope I haven't screwed you up completely. But it's been really, as a newcomer to the city myself, I've only lived in Baltimore City for 3 years. I have learned a ton from my students. So I don't know if that answers, but it's planned time.
I mean, and for each one of the projects that I've worked on at Make the Road, each one of these campaigns, at the beginning of kind of an arc, I would directly ask the students, what do you guys want to work on, right? And then we would brainstorm and we'd have like a chart piece of paper, and then they would say, yeah, I like this one, and then we would come to a consensus because we don't want to be doing 4 different topics or 5 different topics at the same time. And so people would be like, actually, let's talk about the municipal ID thing because there's going to be a vote in a month, right? So the city's going to be voting in a month. So we've got a deadline. We've got to make the testimony, we've got to make the video, and get it to there in a month. All right, so what's next? Okay, well, ICE is happening now. Let's talk about ICE now, right? Or the Let's Drive New Jersey driver's license campaign's happening now, and the proposal's before the legislator. legislature, we need to move on this because this is kind of a timely thing. So I don't know what we'll be doing in 3 months, right? Because by that point, the vote will have happened, and then my students will say, actually, this is the thing that we care about the most right now. And okay, that's good. Let's kind of go and do that. The other thing, I saw your hand up, sorry, 1 second. But so the other project that I could say I'm working on informally is as a professor, I teach at night. So when I go to the Y, I go in the afternoon, and so all the people at the Y in the afternoon are slightly older than me, even though I'm really old, they're even older than I am. And so I have ongoing conversations in the sauna along these lines, right? So if you go to the Y, and if you go to the Y, like, you don't go to the same time, you go to the same locker, right? You just become creatures of habit, right? And so, like, I'm in the sauna with the same old guys all the time. And so we're having this ongoing conversation, you know, about politics, about society, about immigration, about these sorts of things, right? And I'm trying to also be open. Like, I go in there with the idea that, like, you know, I think their ideas about immigration are misguided. I think their ideas about trans rights or gay rights are misguided. I also have to think that, like, what do I understand that I have to be open to them changing my mind about, right? So that I'm not just in there pontificating, but, like, if this is truly going to be a dialogue, I have to be open to them kind of teaching me something about the town, right? And certainly they've taught me a lot about kind of the history of the town and the sense of the town, right? I don't have videos of that because that would be problematic. Us sitting around in the sauna talking about these sorts of things, there's lots of complicated waivers, particularly since we're streaming, it get even more complicated. So, but so I was to say that this is not simply a rhetorical question, but I take this quite seriously, and I'm trying to think of ways and places that I can engage in this sort of informal civic education. I lived in Sacramento for a couple of years, and I ended up taking a bus with people like every single day. And so that was also kind of like an informal learning environment where we would have ongoing dialogues. And most of the time we know, where does learning come from? It doesn't come from the short dialogue. As great as I am, it doesn't come from this session, right? It comes from longitudinal, long-term, ongoing discussions that you have with people, right? And so how often are we in situations when you can have this long-term, ongoing conversation? That's when real learning takes place. The metrics of a semester or the metrics of a month, those are kind of useless metrics, right? Real metrics are a year, 2 years, 3 years. What have you learned sort of longitudinally, right? So other things are kind of short-term statistical blips. Yeah, you had your hand up?
I did. So I definitely, you know, I want to create passionate citizens, but I feel like some of our students really have a tendency to shy away from civic engagement. So I'm wondering, in the examples that you all have given, have you seen a reticence or a tendency to balk at getting involved in endeavors like this?
And just to add to that, Jenny, I'm not even sure, in our class, there are differing opinions and reactions.
We have we have a very diverse group.
Well, they're also from countries where protesting, much less,
Yeah.
or speaking out, much less protesting, will get you arrested or worse.
So there's fear,
You mean like
and there's
here?
also
Yes.
different reactions.
Yes.
So
So what's your experience been with that?
So for my class, I would say that because it's very open to their own interest and their own very localized learning, that not only have they been interested, but they've been engaged in a way that I haven't seen in the past. Because it's literally a problem in your personal neighborhood that you would like to call attention to.
Right.
So that's everything, like I said, from recycling to interactions with the police.
Right.
Or, I mean, you know, it's
But to take it a step further and have them, you know,
so, and
talk to the town
Yeah.
council is a different.
so to your point, some, I guess my inclination for some of my students, who we're still kind of working on expungement and some other issues that we're not trying to be out there, by using some alternative kind of pedagogical methods like photo voice, they're literally turning a lens on the problem, but the lens isn't on them.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's kind of a, I guess, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think as part of that, this really does go back to what's your role in the classroom, right? And so your role in the classroom is not to either indoctrinate them or to tell them that they need to be politically active, right?
Right.
Or they need to be agentic, right? So, but you do need to create opportunities for that to happen, because many of them come, if you come from the US as well, come from educational traditions where that's not option. Right? And so a student's not going to be like, hey, can we talk about what happened in the news because I really don't understand. They may not even think that that's what you can do in school, right? So as a teacher, you can create these opportunities and model, like, we can talk about this if you want to talk about this. And if students choose to do that, great. If they don't choose to do that, great too. Right?
And that's a fine line that we walk because we are a nonprofit.
Right.
So we have to be very careful.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, you can be informative, but you can't be.
Yeah.
And the other thing too that I often come back to is when people talk about Paulo Freire or other sort of critical pedagogy people, they're like, it's always talking about oppression and that sort of stuff. And like, I remember when I was working in that public housing complex, in the summers, with no air conditioning, we're in the basement, there'd be like a little window, right? So we're like all sweating, right? And occasionally we'd just be like, man, if you could have a scoop of ice cream right now, like what ice cream flavor do you like? Right, so we were talking about that, and in the name of critical pedagogy, I don't think I needed to go like, you know, cows are really exploited. It's just like, right now in this basement, like to survive this heat, we're all gonna imagine eating a scoop of ice cream, and we don't have to make this sort of like political critique of it. Now, should you have some students that are like vegans, or you could have that conversation, right? And you're not sort of bracketing off that conversation, but it doesn't mean every conversation has to go there immediately, or you really have to listen to the students and offer opportunities for that dialogue. But if they don't pick it up, you can't force it. And part of that is like some of this work I published in a chapter in a book a few years ago about African American literacy, African American women's literacies. So I was the only non-African American woman with a chapter in the book. So a lot of the chapter is about like what I don't know, right? And this type of thing. So part of the chapter focuses on listening to what students say when they're silent, right? And that we can misread silence just as easily as we can misread what someone says. Right? And I think we often misread silence because of the presumptions that we make, right? Because we don't have epistemological humility. When someone's quiet, we think it means one thing, but they may be saying something completely different with that silence, right? And the other thing is because there are unknown unknowns, we might even miss silences that exist, right? So we might not notice when someone's being silent. Right? And so therefore, we're missing a lot of things that they're communicating because we're not picking up on when they're being silent, right? And a lot of our students would be in that position, right? Particularly if we think about the risks that they take if they're becoming engaged or, or active, right? So they may not be saying anything, and by doing so, they're saying a lot, right? And we have to be attuned to when they're like, that doesn't mean they're disengaged. It means that they're telling us something by their silence, and so we have to be attuned to that, I think.
Right. So I'm going to suggest with that piece of wisdom, we break for lunch.